life in prison without possibility of parole. That is the sentence of this court. 68-year-old Gerald Thompson stood motionless before Judge Robert Martinez in a Washington state courtroom on a gray November afternoon in 2019, showing no visible reaction as the judge pronounced the harshest possible sentence for the murder of 34-year-old school bus driver Marcus Williams. Throughout the 4-week trial, Gerald had maintained an unsettling demeanor that alternated between complete detachment and occasional flashes of anger when testimony contradicted his version of events. His defense attorneys had argued that Gerald suffered from early-stage dementia that had impaired his judgment, that the shooting had occurred during a mental health crisis, and that his age and declining health warranted consideration despite the severity of his crime. But the jury, after hearing overwhelming evidence of premeditation, Marcus's complete innocence in the confrontation, and Gerald's own recorded statements showing clear awareness of his actions, had rejected the diminished capacity defense and convicted him of first-degree murder. What made this case particularly tragic was not just that Gerald Thompson had shot an unarmed man who was simply doing his job, driving children safely to school, but that the murder had been motivated by a minor traffic dispute that Gerald had escalated through rage, paranoia, and a complete inability to control his anger. Marcus Williams had been a devoted father, a beloved member of his community, and a professional who took pride in safely transporting hundreds of children daily. His death at the hands of an elderly man who couldn't accept a minor inconvenience on the road would leave his family devastated, his community outraged, and profound questions about how an aging population's mental health issues intersect with access to firearms and capacity for violence. Before we continue with this deeply troubling case, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from as we explore this case of road rage turned deadly, the murder of a school bus driver, and the complex questions about age, mental decline, and criminal responsibility. The city of Tacoma, Washington, population approximately 220,000, sits on Puget Sound, about 30 miles south of Seattle. A diverse working-class city with a rich maritime history, Tacoma had experienced significant revitalization in recent decades, while maintaining its character as a community where longtime residents and newcomers lived alongside each other. The city's economy centered on the Port of Tacoma, healthcare, education, and service industries, with many residents working in Seattle but living in Tacoma for more affordable housing. It was a place where neighborhoods ranged from affluent waterfront areas to struggling working-class communities, where public transportation and school buses navigated busy streets daily, and where minor traffic disputes were common but rarely escalated to violence. The Thompson family had lived in Tacoma for over 4 decades, with Gerald and his late wife Margaret, having raised their 3 children in a modest home in the city's North End neighborhood. Gerald had worked for 30 years as an electrician before retiring in 2010, and he had been known in his earlier years as a competent professional and devoted family man. However, evidence would emerge suggesting that Gerald's personality had changed significantly in his later years, with increasing irritability, paranoia, and episodes of rage that concerned his family, but that they had struggled to address effectively. Marcus Emmanuel Williams was 34 years old when Gerald Thompson shot him to death on the morning of March 15, 2019. A school bus driver for Tacoma Public Schools for 8 years, Marcus represented the kind of dedicated professional who made a difference in children's lives through competence, consistency, and genuine care for the students he transported. With an impeccable safety record, numerous commendations from parents and school administrators, and a reputation as someone who knew each child on his route by name and who created a positive environment on his bus, Marcus had been exactly the kind of employee that school districts valued and that parents trusted with their children's safety. Marcuse's personality was described consistently by family, friends, co-workers, and parents of children on his route as genuinely kind, patient, and possessed of a calm professionalism that made him perfectly suited to the challenges of safely transporting children. His supervisor at the transportation department would later testify that in 8 years of driving, Marcus had never received a single complaint, had never been involved in an accident, and had been consistently praised for his adherence to safety protocols and his positive interactions with students and parents. Marcus understood that being a school bus driver isn't just about driving, it's about being a trusted presence in children's daily lives. His supervisor, Patricia Anderson, would testify. Parents knew their kids were safe with Marcus. Kids looked forward to getting on his bus because he greeted each one by name and made the ride pleasant. He took pride in his work and understood the responsibility he carried every time he got behind that wheel. Beyond his professional accomplishments, Marcus had been a devoted father to his 2 children, 8-year-old Isaiah and 6-year-old Zoe, who he was raising as a single parent following his divorce 2 years earlier. Friends and family members described Marcus as someone whose entire life revolved around his children coaching Isaiah's youth basketball team, attending every one of Zoe's dance recitals, carefully planning his work schedule to maximize time with his kids, and creating a stable, loving home despite the challenges of single parenthood. Marcus's ex-wife, Jennifer Williams, would testify during trial that, despite their marriage ending, Marcus had remained committed to co-parenting and had been the best father imaginable to their children. Marcus and I couldn't make our marriage work, but he never let that affect his relationship with Isaiah and Zoe, Jennifer stated. He was always there for them. He planned his entire life around being present for our kids. They were everything to him. Marcus's relationship with his own parents, Daniel and Catherine Williams, had been particularly close. As an only child, Marcus had maintained regular contact with his parents, calling them daily, visiting multiple times per week, and including them extensively in his children's lives. Daniel would later describe his son as my best friend as well as my son, and Catherine would testify that losing Marcus had destroyed a part of me that will never heal. In the weeks before his death, Marcus had been dealing with the typical challenges of single parenthood and managing a demanding work schedule. But by all accounts he had been happy and optimistic about the future. He had been saving money toward purchasing a house, had been dating someone new who he was excited about, and had been planning a summer vacation with his children to visit relatives in California. Friends who knew him well described him as being in one of the most contented periods of his adult life, financially stable, enjoying his work, feeling confident as a parent, and hopeful about his romantic relationship. The morning of March 15th, 2019, was a Friday, and Marcus had been driving his regular morning route, transporting elementary school children to Sheridan Elementary School in Tacoma's North End. According to the timeline that would be reconstructed through witness testimony, bus camera footage, and GPS data, Marcus had been driving his prescribed route, adhering to all traffic laws and safety protocols, when he encountered Gerald Thompson's vehicle at the intersection of North 26th Street and Proctor Street around 8:15 a.m. What occurred at and after that intersection would be reconstructed through multiple sources. Testimony from children on the bus, statements from witnesses in nearby vehicles and homes, extensive video footage from the school bus's multiple cameras, and ultimately Gerald Thompson's own statements to police. The sequence of events revealed not a sudden, impulsive shooting, but rather an escalating confrontation driven by Gerald's disproportionate rage over a minor traffic situation and his decision to pursue Marcus, confront him, and ultimately shoot him in cold blood in front of the children Marcus was transporting. The initial encounter at the intersection of North 26th and Proctor was captured partially on the school bus's forward-facing camera. Marcus had been proceeding through his route when he approached the intersection where he needed to make a left turn. According to traffic regulations and standard bus driver protocol, Marcus had activated his turn signal well in advance and had begun moving into the left turn lane. Gerald Thompson's vehicle, a pickup truck, had been behind Marcus's bus and had apparently wanted to proceed straight through the intersection rather than wait behind the turning bus. Video footage and witness testimony established that Gerald had honked his horn repeatedly at the school bus, apparently upset that Marcus was turning and would delay Gerald's progress through the intersection. Marcus, following proper protocol and unable to safely change his route to accommodate an impatient driver behind him, had completed his left turn and continued on his route. This should have been the end of the interaction, a minor, forgettable moment of traffic frustration that occurs countless times daily in every city. But for Gerald Thompson, this minor inconvenience triggered a rage response that would escalate to murder. Rather than continuing on his own route, Gerald had followed the school bus after it turned. Multiple witnesses would testify to observing Gerald's pickup truck following closely behind the bus, much closer than safe following distance for several blocks. Some witnesses reported seeing Gerald gesturing angrily from his truck, though from their distances they couldn't determine exactly what he was doing. Marcus, aware that he was being followed closely by an aggressive driver, and concerned for the safety of the children on his bus, had radioed his dispatcher to report the situation. The radio transmission, recorded and later played during trial, captured Marcus's calm professionalism even as he dealt with a concerning situation. "Dispatch, this is Bus 47. I've got a pickup truck tailgating me pretty aggressively after I made my turn at 26th and Proctor. Gray Ford F-150. Driver appears agitated. I'm continuing my route, but wanted to document this in case it escalates." Over. The dispatcher had acknowledged the transmission and had advised Marcus to continue his route while remaining aware of the vehicle behind him, standard protocol for dealing with aggressive drivers near school buses. What neither Marcus nor the dispatcher anticipated was how far Gerald's rage would drive him to escalate the situation. After following the bus for approximately 6 blocks, Gerald had accelerated past the bus and had then deliberately slowed down in front of it, forcing Marcus to slow to avoid rear-ending the truck. This maneuver, commonly known as brake checking, demonstrated that Gerald was deliberately attempting to create a confrontation, rather than simply being an impatient driver who wanted to get around the bus and continue on his way. Marcus had maintained professional composure, continuing to drive safely and deliberately, avoiding any response that might escalate the situation or compromise the safety of his passengers. The bus's internal cameras showed Marcus remaining calm, occasionally checking his mirrors to monitor the truck's position, but showing no signs of anger or agitation himself. After brake checking the bus twice, Gerald had pulled into a residential driveway ahead of the bus's route, parking in a way that forced Marcus to slow significantly as he passed. Video from the bus's side-facing camera showed Gerald exiting his truck as the bus passed, and witnesses would later testify that Gerald appeared to be shouting at the bus, though his words couldn't be heard over the sounds of traffic and the bus's engine. Marcus had continued his route, likely hoping that Gerald would give up and leave. But Gerald had gotten back in his truck and had continued following the bus, maintaining close distance and continuing his aggressive driving behavior. Children on the bus, while perhaps not fully understanding the danger they were in, had noticed the truck following them, and had asked Marcus why the man in the truck seemed angry. Marcus, according to testimony from the children, had reassured them that everything was fine, that the man was probably just having a bad morning, and that they shouldn't worry. Even as he dealt with an increasingly concerning situation, Marcus had maintained his composure and had prioritized keeping the children calm and feeling safe. The situation reached its crisis point when the bus arrived at Sheridan Elementary School. According to school protocol and standard safety procedures, Marcus had pulled into the school's loading zone, had activated the bus's stop sign and flashing lights, and had begun the process of safely disembarking the children. This was a routine moment that Marcus had performed thousands of times, ensuring each child exited safely, watching to make sure they made it to the school entrance, maintaining the safe environment that was his primary responsibility. Gerald had pulled his truck into the school parking lot and had parked near the bus. According to witness testimony from school staff members who were outside supervising student arrival, Gerald had exited his truck and had immediately begun walking toward the bus in an aggressive manner, shouting loudly enough to be heard across the parking lot. Marcus, seeing Gerald approaching and recognizing that a confrontation was imminent, had made a decision that probably saved the lives of the children still on his bus. He had quickly exited the bus himself, closing the door behind him to create a barrier between the children and the aggressive man approaching, and had walked toward Gerald to intercept him before he could reach the bus. What happened next was captured on school security cameras and witnessed by multiple school staff members and parents dropping off children. The footage and testimony would provide clear evidence that Marcus Williams had done everything possible to de-escalate the situation, that he had posed no threat to Gerald Thompson, and that the shooting that followed was not defensive, but rather an execution of an innocent man by someone whose rage had completely overwhelmed any capacity for rational thought or restraint. Marcus had approached Gerald with his hands visible and empty, his body language non-threatening. Audio from the school security system captured the exchange, providing crucial evidence about the interaction in the final minutes before Marcus's death. "Sir, I need you to calm down," Marcus could be heard saying, his voice calm but firm. "There are children present. Whatever you're upset about, we can discuss it calmly, but I need you to step back from the bus." Gerald's response, captured clearly on the audio, revealed the complete disproportionality of his rage to the initial minor traffic situation. "You cut me off back there. You think you own the fucking road because you're driving a school bus? I've been driving for 50 years and I'm not going to be disrespected by some punk who doesn't know how to drive." "Sir, I followed all traffic laws and proper protocol," Marcus responded, his voice remaining steady. "I'm sorry if you felt inconvenienced, but I was making a legitimate turn on my route. I need you to leave now so I can get these children safely into school." This reasonable response apparently further enraged Gerald. Witnesses would describe seeing him become visibly more agitated, his face reddening, his body tensing. A school staff member had already called 911 at this point, reporting an aggressive man confronting a school bus driver. But police response would come too late. "You don't get to tell me what to do," Gerald shouted, stepping closer to Marcus in a threatening manner. "I'm not going anywhere until you apologize for disrespecting me on the road." "I'm not going to apologize for doing my job properly," Marcus stated, his voice showing perhaps the first hint of frustration but remaining professional. "You need to leave school property immediately, or I'm going to call the police." This statement, Marcus asserting appropriate boundaries and invoking potential police involvement, proved to be the trigger that pushed Gerald from verbal confrontation to lethal violence. In testimony and statements that would later be analyzed extensively, Gerald would claim that Marcus had threatened him by mentioning police, that he had felt intimidated by Marcus's presence, and that he had feared for his safety. However, video evidence would definitively disprove these claims and would show that what happened next was not self-defense, but murder. Gerald had reached into his jacket pocket and had pulled out a handgun, a .38 caliber revolver, that he habitually carried despite having no concealed carry permit, and despite Washington state law prohibiting firearms on school grounds under any circumstances. Multiple witnesses described the moment when Marcus had seen the gun, his expression changing from firm professionalism to shock and fear. Marcus had immediately raised his hands in a universal gesture of non-threat and surrender. Whoa, hold on," Marcus said, his voice now clearly showing fear. "Put the gun away. There's no need for this. Just put the gun away and leave." But Gerald had not put the gun away. Instead, he had raised it and pointed it directly at Marcus's chest. For several seconds that witnesses described as feeling like an eternity, the two men stood frozen Marcus with his hands up, clearly unarmed and not threatening. Gerald with the gun pointed at Marcus's chest, his hand shaking with rage or adrenaline or both. "I'm done being disrespected," Gerald had said, his voice cold and deliberate. Then he had pulled the trigger. The gunshot, captured on multiple recording devices and heard by dozens of witnesses, shattered the morning calm of the school arrival area. Marcus had been struck in the chest, the bullet entering near his heart. He had staggered backward, his expression showing shock and pain, before collapsing onto the pavement. The immediate aftermath captured on school security footage showed chaos as school staff members rushed toward Marcus while simultaneously trying to evacuate children who were arriving at school and who had witnessed the shooting. Gerald had stood over Marcus's fallen body for several seconds, the gun still in his hand, appearing almost confused about what he had just done. A vice principal named Robert Chen, showing remarkable courage, had approached Gerald carefully and had convinced him to lower the weapon. Gerald had complied, seeming to suddenly register where he was and what he had done. By the time police arrived approximately 3 minutes later, Gerald was sitting on a curb near his truck, the gun on the ground beside him, staring at his hands as if he couldn't comprehend what they had just done. Marcus had been conscious initially, gasping for air and bleeding extensively from the chest wound. Paramedics had arrived quickly and had immediately begun emergency treatment, but the damage was catastrophic. The bullet had struck Marcus's heart, and despite aggressive intervention by paramedics and emergency room physicians at nearby St. Joseph Medical Center, Marcus had died approximately 30 minutes after being shot, never regaining consciousness after the initial moments following the shooting. The investigation that followed was straightforward in establishing the basic facts. Gerald Thompson had shot Marcus Williams in front of multiple witnesses and on camera, but would become more complex in understanding Gerald's mental state, his motivations, and the question of whether his age and potential cognitive decline affected his criminal culpability. Detective Sarah Martinez of the Tacoma Police Department, the lead investigator assigned to the case, had interviewed Gerald at the scene immediately after his arrest. Gerald had been advised of his Miranda rights and had initially declined to speak without an attorney. However, as he was being transported to jail, he had begun talking, making statements that would later prove crucial to establishing premeditation and criminal intent. "I didn't mean to shoot him," Gerald had stated in the patrol car, the conversation captured on the officer's body camera. "I just wanted him to show me some respect. I'm a senior citizen. I've been driving since before he was born. He had no right to disrespect me on the road like that." When the officer had pointed out that Marcus had been doing his job following traffic laws, Gerald's response revealed the depth of his narcissistic rage. "I don't care about his job. I don't care about traffic laws. When someone disrespects me, there are consequences. He should have apologized. If he had just apologized and shown me proper respect, none of this would have happened." This statement expressing anger that Marcus hadn't apologized for properly performing his job, and suggesting Marcus bore responsibility for getting shot because he hadn't shown proper respect, demonstrated consciousness of the shooting and complete inability to accept responsibility for his own actions. The forensic evidence collected from the scene confirmed witness accounts and video evidence. The gun Gerald had used was unregistered, and Gerald had no concealed carry permit, meaning his possession of the weapon on school property was itself a felony independent of the shooting. Ballistic analysis confirmed that Gerald's gun had fired the fatal shot. Gunshot residue on Gerald's hands confirmed he had recently fired a weapon. The trajectory of the bullet, entering Marcus's chest while Marcus's hands were raised, confirmed that Marcus had posed no threat when shot. Perhaps most significantly, analysis of the school security footage by forensic experts demonstrated definitively that Marcus had never made any threatening gesture, had never reached toward Gerald in any way that could be misinterpreted as aggressive, and had maintained a defensive posture throughout the confrontation. The shooting could not be characterized as self-defense by any reasonable interpretation of the evidence. The interrogation of Gerald Thompson, conducted the day after the shooting with his court-appointed attorney present, provided additional evidence of premeditation and intentional violence. Detective Martinez had approached the interview strategically, recognizing that Gerald's narcissism and need to justify his actions might lead him to provide incriminating information while attempting to explain his reasoning. Gerald had begun the interview by attempting to portray himself as the victim, claiming that Marcus had provoked the confrontation by cutting him off in traffic. When Martinez pointed out that video evidence showed Marcus had simply made a legal turn on his bus route, Gerald had become defensive. "He made me wait," Gerald had insisted. "He knew I was behind him, and he deliberately turned to slow me down. That's disrespectful. That's why everything else happened." Everything else meaning you following his bus for multiple blocks, brake-checking him, and ultimately shooting him, Martinez had asked. "I followed him because I wanted an apology," Gerald stated. "He owed me an apology for disrespecting an elder. When we got to the school, I went to talk to him about proper road manners. Things escalated." "Did Marcus Williams ever threaten you physically?" Martinez asked. "He threatened to call the police on me," Gerald responded, apparently considering this equivalent to physical threat. "But did he threaten you with physical violence? Did he make any move to attack you?" Gerald had paused, seemingly recognizing that his answer mattered. "He was bigger than me. He was intimidating just by being there." "But did he specifically threaten you or move to attack you?" "No, but I felt threatened. I have a right to defend myself." This exchange, recorded and later played during trial, demonstrated that Gerald could not identify any specific threat from Marcus beyond his mere presence and his refusal to apologize. It also showed Gerald's attempt to construct a self-defense narrative, despite lacking any facts to support such a claim. When Martinez asked directly about the moment Gerald pulled the trigger, his response was chilling in its casualness. "I wanted him to understand that disrespecting people has consequences. I pulled the gun to make him take me seriously. He still wouldn't apologize. He kept telling me to leave. So I shot him. I didn't really think about it. I just pulled the trigger. Maybe I thought it would just scare him or wound him. I didn't necessarily want to kill him. But I wanted him to understand you can't treat people like they don't matter." This statement, describing the shooting as a deliberate choice to make Marcus understand something, rather than as an impulsive fear response, directly contradicted any claim of self-defense and instead established premeditated intent to use violence to enforce Gerald's perceived right to respect and deference. The decision to charge Gerald Thompson as a competent adult facing murder charges came after extensive evaluation by forensic psychiatrists who assessed whether his age and potential cognitive decline affected his criminal responsibility. Gerald was 68 years old at the time of the shooting, and his family would later claim that he had been showing signs of dementia or cognitive decline that affected his judgment. However, multiple psychiatric evaluations conducted in the months after his arrest concluded that while Gerald showed some age-related cognitive changes, he did not suffer from dementia or cognitive impairment sufficient to affect his understanding of right and wrong, or his capacity to control his behavior. The evaluators noted that Gerald's actions showed clear planning: following the bus, getting his gun ready, approaching Marcus; clear understanding of the consequences of violence. He initially tried to use the gun as an intimidation tool, and clear awareness afterward that he had done something wrong. His statements expressing surprise at his own actions. On March 20th, 2019, 5 days after Marcus's murder, Gerald Thompson was formally charged with first-degree murder with a firearm enhancement, illegal possession of a firearm on school grounds, and assault with a deadly weapon. He was held on $2 million bail, which his family could not afford, meaning he remained in custody awaiting trial. The impact on Marcus Williams's family was immediate and devastating. His children, 8-year-old Isaiah and 6-year-old Zoe, had lost their father suddenly and violently. Jennifer Williams, despite her divorce from Marcus, described being shattered by his death and struggling to explain to their children why their father wasn't coming home. Marcus's parents, Daniel and Catherine, were inconsolable, with Daniel later describing how "my entire purpose in life died with my son." The impact extended beyond Marcus's immediate family to the broader community. Parents whose children had been on Marcus's bus that morning struggled to help their kids process the trauma of being present during a shooting. Sheridan Elementary School brought in crisis counselors to work with students and staff. The Tacoma community organized vigils and memorials for Marcus, with hundreds attending to honor a man who had dedicated his professional life to keeping children safe, and who had died trying to protect them from violence. The trial of State of Washington versus Gerald Thompson began on September 9, 2019, in Pierce County Superior Court before Judge Robert Martinez. The case had attracted significant media attention throughout Washington state and had gained some national coverage given the context of a school bus driver being murdered by a road rage gunman on school property in front of children. The courtroom was filled daily with Marcus's family and supporters, school district employees, and community members who had been touched by the tragedy. Jury selection proved challenging, with potential jurors expressing difficulty maintaining objectivity about a case where an elderly man had shot an unarmed school bus driver. Many potential jurors had strong feelings about road rage violence, guns on school property, or knew Marcus or his family given Tacoma's interconnected community. After 2 weeks of careful examination, a jury of 8 women and 4 men was seated, all of whom had affirmed their ability to evaluate evidence fairly, despite Gerald's age and despite the sympathetic nature of the victim. Lead prosecutor James Wilson opened the trial by immediately establishing Marcus's complete innocence and Gerald's unjustifiable rage. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a good man who died for no reason. Marcus Williams was doing his job safely transporting children to school. He followed every traffic law, every safety protocol. Gerald Thompson was inconvenienced for approximately 30 seconds when Marcus made a left turn on his regular bus route. That 30-second delay made Gerald Thompson so angry that he followed. Marcus confronted him on school property and shot him dead in front of children. This is not self-defense. This is murder driven by narcissistic rage and complete inability to control anger over a minor traffic situation. Wilson displayed photographs of Marcus on the courtroom screen in his bus driver uniform, with his children receiving a safety award from the school district. Marcus Williams was 34 years old. He was a devoted father to 2 young children who need him. He was a professional who took pride in his work and who had an unblemished record of keeping children safe. Gerald Thompson took all of that away because he couldn't tolerate waiting 30 seconds behind a school bus. The evidence will show you beyond any doubt that this was intentional murder, that Marcus posed no threat, and that Gerald Thompson deserves to be convicted of first-degree murder. Defense attorney Patricia Chen faced the enormous challenge of defending a client who had shot an unarmed man on camera in front of dozens of witnesses. Chen's opening strategy focused on arguing that Gerald's age and declining mental capacity had impaired his judgment, that he had genuinely felt threatened by Marcus despite objective evidence showing no threat existed, and that the appropriate verdict was not first-degree murder, but rather manslaughter based on impaired mental state. Members of the jury, you are going to hear about a terrible tragedy. Marcus Williams is dead, shot by Gerald Thompson. This is not in dispute. But what you must determine is whether Gerald Thompson is guilty of intentional first-degree murder or whether he was an elderly man experiencing cognitive decline who reacted impulsively and inappropriately to a situation he perceived, wrongly, as threatening. Gerald Thompson is 68 years old. Medical evidence will show he suffers from early-stage cognitive impairment that affects his judgment, his impulse control, and his perception of threats. On March 15, 2019, Gerald made terrible decisions that resulted in an innocent man's death. He should be held accountable, but the charge should reflect the reality of cognitive decline rather than treating him like a young, fully capable defendant who planned a murder. This defense strategy, essentially conceding the killing while arguing about Gerald's mental state, was Chen's only viable approach given the overwhelming evidence. However, prosecutors would effectively demonstrate that Gerald's behavior before, during, and after the shooting showed he understood what he was doing, and that cognitive decline could not excuse murder. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 weeks, with witnesses and evidence creating a comprehensive portrait of the shooting, Marcus's innocence, and Gerald's culpability. The testimony began with Marcus's family and friends describing his character and the impact of his death. Daniel Williams, Marcus's father, provided heartbreaking testimony about his son's life and the permanent void his death had created. Marcus was my only child, Daniel testified through tears. He was a good man who worked hard, who loved his kids more than anything, who took pride in his job keeping children safe. He got up every morning excited to go to work because he knew he was making a difference in kids' lives. And he died doing his job protecting children from a violent man. I will never recover from losing my son. Never. Jennifer Williams testified about Marcus's devotion as a father and about the impact on their children. "Isaiah and Zoe ask me every day when Daddy is coming home," Jennifer said, crying. "They don't understand death yet, don't understand that he's never coming back. Marcus's entire life revolved around being a good father. He would have done anything for those kids, and now they're growing up without him because a man couldn't control his temper over a 30-second delay in traffic." The testimony from children who had been on the bus provided powerful evidence of the trauma Gerald had inflicted beyond just killing Marcus. Several children, now slightly older but still clearly affected by what they had witnessed, testified about hearing the gunshot, about seeing Marcus fall, about being scared and confused. One 9-year-old girl described having nightmares for months afterward. A 10-year-old boy testified about being afraid to ride school buses now. These testimonies established the broader impact of Gerald's violence, not just Marcus's death, but the trauma inflicted on innocent children who had been present during the shooting. The most powerful evidence came from the video and audio footage capturing the entire confrontation. The prosecution played the school security footage that showed Marcus exiting the bus with no weapon, approaching Gerald with hands visible and body language non-threatening, maintaining a defensive posture throughout the confrontation, and being shot while his hands were raised in surrender. The footage was so clear, so irrefutable in showing Marcus's innocence and Gerald's aggression, that several jurors were visibly emotional while watching. The audio captured from the school's security system provided additional crucial evidence. The jury heard Gerald's rage-filled accusations, heard Marcus's calm attempts to de-escalate, heard Gerald refusing to leave despite repeated requests, and heard the gunshot that ended Marcus's life. Combined with the video, the audio created an undeniable record of the shooting's circumstances. Forensic testimony provided clinical confirmation of what the video showed. The medical examiner testified that Marcus had been shot once in the chest, that the bullet had struck his heart, and that death had occurred within minutes despite emergency medical intervention. The trajectory of the bullet confirmed Marcus had been facing Gerald with his body in an upright, non-aggressive posture when shot. The testimony about Gerald's gun provided evidence of additional crimes beyond the murder itself. A firearms expert testified that Gerald had no permit to carry a concealed weapon, that the gun was unregistered, and that carrying any firearm on school property violated Washington state law. This testimony established that Gerald had been committing felonies simply by having the gun, independent of his decision to use it. Perhaps most damning was the testimony about Gerald's statements to police. The recorded interviews were played for the jury, allowing them to hear Gerald describe following Marcus because he wanted an apology, describe feeling disrespected, and describe shooting Marcus as a deliberate choice to make him understand there are consequences for disrespect. These statements directly contradicted any self-defense narrative and instead showed intentional violence motivated by wounded pride. The prosecution's final significant evidence came from mental health experts who had evaluated Gerald and who testified that he did not suffer from dementia or cognitive impairment sufficient to affect criminal culpability. Dr. William Foster, a forensic psychiatrist who had conducted extensive evaluation of Gerald, testified that while Gerald showed some age-related cognitive changes, these did not rise to the level of legal insanity or diminished capacity. Gerald Thompson understands right from wrong, Dr. Foster testified. He understands that shooting someone is illegal and wrong. He understands the consequences of violence. What he has is not dementia or cognitive impairment affecting legal capacity. What he has is a personality characterized by narcissism, entitlement, and inability to control rage. These are character issues, not cognitive impairment. He knew what he was doing when he shot Marcus Williams. He chose to do it anyway because his anger overwhelmed his self-control. This testimony directly undercut the defense's primary argument and established that Gerald should be held fully responsible for his actions despite his age. The defense's case, presented over 1 week, focused primarily on attempting to establish that Gerald's cognitive decline had affected his judgment and his perception of threat. The defense called family members who testified that Gerald had been showing signs of forgetfulness, confusion, and personality changes in the year before the shooting. His daughter, Rebecca Thompson, testified that her father wasn't himself in his final years, that he had become more irritable and paranoid, and that the family had been concerned about his mental state. However, this testimony was effectively challenged on cross-examination when Prosecutor Wilson established that despite these concerns, the family had never sought formal medical evaluation for Gerald, had never tried to restrict his driving or his access to firearms, and had essentially done nothing to address the behaviors they now claimed were signs of dementia. The defense's psychiatric expert, Dr. Linda Martinez, testified that in her evaluation, Gerald showed signs consistent with early-stage cognitive decline that could have affected his judgment and impulse control. However, on cross-examination, Wilson got Dr. Martinez to acknowledge that Gerald's behavior showed planning and awareness inconsistent with the kind of impairment that would excuse criminal responsibility. Most significantly, the defense did not call Gerald to testify, recognizing that his personality and his continued inability to accept responsibility would be devastating to his case. The jury heard from Gerald only through his recorded statements to police, which were more than sufficient to establish his guilt. The closing arguments began on October 3, 2019. Prosecutor Wilson delivered a powerful synthesis of the evidence and an emotional appeal for justice for Marcus. Ladies and gentlemen, you have seen overwhelming evidence that Gerald Thompson murdered Marcus Williams in cold blood. Marcus was doing his job. He followed traffic laws. He tried to de-escalate the confrontation. He never threatened Gerald. And Gerald shot him dead because Gerald's pride couldn't tolerate 30 seconds of inconvenience. This is not self-defense. This is not cognitive impairment. This is murder by a man who believed he was entitled to respect and deference, and who was willing to kill rather than accept a minor frustration. Defense attorney Chen made a final appeal for the jury to consider Gerald's age and cognitive state. Gerald Thompson made terrible decisions that resulted in an innocent man's death. He should be held accountable. But this was not the calculated act of a young, fully capable killer. This was an elderly man with declining cognitive function who reacted impulsively and inappropriately. He deserves punishment, but first-degree murder requires intent and premeditation that the evidence doesn't support given his mental state. The jury began deliberations on October 4, 2019, at 10:30 a.m. They deliberated for approximately 9 hours before reaching a verdict, returning to the courtroom at 7:15 p.m. The relatively quick deliberations suggested the evidence of first-degree murder had been compelling, despite the defense's arguments about cognitive decline. Judge Martinez asked the jury foreman if they had reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied. "In the matter of State of Washington versus Gerald Thompson on the charge of first-degree murder, how do you find?" "We find the defendant guilty." Marcus's family embraced, crying with relief that justice had been achieved. Gerald showed minimal visible reaction, sitting motionless at the defense table. His family members in the gallery were devastated, with Rebecca crying openly as she processed that her father would likely die in prison. The jury also found Gerald guilty on the charges of illegal possession of a firearm on school grounds and assault with a deadly weapon. These additional convictions meant Gerald faced mandatory life in prison. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for November 15, 2019, 6 weeks after conviction. Those weeks gave Marcus's family time to prepare victim impact statements and to process the verdict, while Gerald remained in custody awaiting sentencing. The sentencing hearing began with victim impact statements that provided the most emotionally powerful moments of the entire case. Daniel Williams spoke about losing his only son and about the permanent damage to his family. "Marcus was everything to me," Daniel testified. "He was my son, my friend, my pride and joy. Gerald Thompson took that away for no reason. He killed my son over a 30-second delay in traffic. How does anyone recover from that? How do I accept that my son died because a man couldn't control his temper?" Jennifer Williams spoke about the impact on Marcus's children. "Isaiah and Zoe will grow up without their father. They'll miss his guidance at every milestone. They'll miss his love and support. Marcus was an amazing father who would have done anything for his kids. And they don't have him because Gerald Thompson decided his pride mattered more than human life." Patricia Anderson, Marcus's supervisor at the school district, spoke about the impact on the community and on other school bus drivers. "Marcus's murder has affected every school bus driver in Tacoma. They wonder if they're safe. They worry about road rage turning violent. Marcus was one of our best drivers, and he died protecting children from violence. That's the legacy Gerald Thompson created." Throughout these statements, Gerald's demeanor remained troublingly flat. He showed minimal emotional response, occasionally appearing to be suppressing yawns or looking around the courtroom rather than focusing on the people describing the impact of his actions. This behavior did not go unnoticed by Judge Martinez or by members of Marcus's family. Defense attorney Chen made a final plea for the court to consider Gerald's age when imposing sentence. "Your Honor, Gerald Thompson is 68 years old. A life sentence means he will die in prison. While the law requires life imprisonment for first-degree murder, we ask the court to at least consider making him eligible for parole at some point, recognizing that he is elderly and poses no ongoing threat to society." Prosecutor Wilson countered by emphasizing that Gerald's age could not excuse the calculated nature of his crime. "Your Honor, Gerald Thompson murdered an innocent man in front of children because he couldn't control his rage over a minor traffic situation. His age doesn't change what he did or the permanent damage he caused. life without parole is the appropriate sentence. Judge Martinez's sentencing remarks captured the case's full significance. Gerald Thompson, you murdered Marcus Williams in cold blood. The evidence showed that you followed him, confronted him, and shot him while he posed no threat to you. You did this because your pride couldn't tolerate a 30-second delay in traffic. You did this in front of children who will carry trauma from witnessing violence for the rest of their lives. You did this to a good man who was simply doing his job. Judge Martinez's tone became more severe as he prepared to impose sentence. I have presided over this court for 22 years. I have sentenced murderers of every age and background, but rarely have I encountered a crime as senseless as this one. Marcus Williams died for no reason beyond your inability to control your temper. Your age does not excuse this. Your alleged cognitive decline does not excuse this. You understood what you were doing. You chose to do it anyway. The judge then pronounced formal sentence. Gerald Thompson, for the first-degree murder of Marcus Williams. This court sentences you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. You will spend the remainder of your life in prison with no possibility of release. That is the sentence required by law and the sentence you deserve. As Gerald was led from the courtroom to begin serving his life sentence, his expression showed a mix of resignation and continued inability to accept full responsibility for what he had done. The courtroom remained largely silent, the weight of the life sentence balanced against the permanent loss of Marcus Williams. The aftermath of Gerald Thompson's conviction and sentencing rippled through the Tacoma community and raised important questions about road rage, firearms, aging, and violence, and justice for victims of senseless crimes. Gerald began serving his life sentence at Washington State Penitentiary, where prison records indicated he remained a difficult inmate who complained about his treatment and showed limited genuine remorse. In a 2021 prison interview with a researcher studying elderly offenders, Gerald demonstrated his continued self-focus. I never meant to kill him. I just wanted respect. If he had just apologized like he should have, none of this would have happened. Now I'm going to die in prison for one mistake. It's not fair. This statement, continuing to blame Marcus for getting shot and characterizing murder as one mistake, demonstrated that even after years of incarceration, Gerald had not developed genuine understanding of his responsibility for Marcus's death. Marcus Williams's children, growing up without their father, faced the long-term impact of losing him to violence. Jennifer Williams, now raising Isaiah and Zoe alone, reported in 2022 that both children struggled with the loss, and that explaining their father's murder remained one of the hardest things she had ever had to do. How do you tell children that their father died because a man was angry about waiting behind a school bus? How do you help them make sense of something so senseless? Daniel and Catherine Williams established the Marcus Williams Memorial Safe Driving Fund, providing education about road rage prevention and school bus safety. The fund kept Marcus's memory alive while working to prevent similar tragedies. The case prompted Tacoma Public Schools to implement new safety protocols for bus drivers dealing with aggressive drivers, including enhanced training and direct emergency contact systems. The district also installed additional security cameras on buses to document interactions with other drivers. The broader discussions the case raised about elderly drivers, cognitive decline, and firearm access proved complex and contentious. Some argued that Gerald's case demonstrated the need for more rigorous driver testing and cognitive screening for elderly individuals. Others pushed back against age-based restrictions, noting that the vast majority of elderly drivers never commit violence and that cognitive decline alone doesn't cause murder. The question of firearm access for individuals showing signs of cognitive decline also generated debate, with gun rights advocates arguing that responsible gun ownership shouldn't be restricted based on age alone, while gun control advocates pointed to Gerald's case as an example of the dangers of inadequate screening and regulation. As of 2024, Gerald Thompson remained incarcerated at age 73, having served 5 years of a life sentence. He would die in prison, having spent his final years behind bars for a murder he committed over a 30-second inconvenience that wounded his pride. Marcus Williams had been dead for 5 years, his children growing up without him, his family permanently scarred by senseless violence. The tragedy of the Thompson case stood as a stark reminder of how road rage can escalate to deadly violence, how narcissistic entitlement can overwhelm moral restraint, and how a minor traffic situation can become a murder scene when someone values pride over human life. Marcus had died doing his job, protecting children from violence even in his final moments. Gerald had destroyed not just Marcus's life, but his own, trading his remaining years of freedom for life imprisonment, because he couldn't accept a momentary delay in his morning commute. The courtroom where Gerald had been sentenced remained the site of ongoing criminal proceedings, though Judge Martinez later said the Thompson case stayed with him as one of the most senseless murders he had encountered. The complete disproportionality between the initial trigger, a legal left turn, and the final outcome, a dead father, traumatized children, and an elderly man sentenced to die in prison, captured the devastating consequences when anger overwhelms reason, and when access to firearms combines with inability to control rage. The case ultimately served as a grim testament to the permanent consequences of momentary loss of control, to the deadly intersection of narcissism and armed violence, and to the inadequacy of any legal outcome to truly address what was lost when Gerald Thompson decided that his wounded pride justified taking a human life.